July 4, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The mess hall is sweltering by mid-afternoon, the ceiling fans pushing warm air across rows of long wooden tables as guards in khaki circulate with metal pitchers of iced tea, and the canteen clerk stacks glass bottles of Coca-Cola behind a screened window. German prisoners in tan-work shirts file past steaming trays, and to their surprise, a line of metal pans packed with a pale, crystalline desert that the Americans call ice cream. The holiday menu is not a feast by peacetime standards, but to men who left behind ration cards and black bread, it feels unreal. White bread soft enough to tear with 2 fingers, slices of meatloaf, potatoes, and a scoop of something cold, sweet, and thick that bites the tongue before melting into milk and sugar. That moment, on a hot Independence Day inside a fenced compound just west of town, captures the question at the heart of this story. Why did the United States, fighting a total war, serve ice cream and Coca-Cola to enemy prisoners of war on its own soil? The short operational answer is that it was not charity. It was policy, logistics, reciprocity, and strategy wrapped in the language of law and delivered through a supply system built for abundance. The longer answer begins with rules, scales, and incentives that governed every camp from Arizona to Wisconsin, and that turned familiar. American foods into instruments of compliance, propaganda, intelligence, and post-war positioning. The United States had accepted the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Years before, it found itself guarding them in continental camps. By late 1942, and especially through 1943, as North African and European campaigns captured large numbers of Axis troops, the War Department committed publicly and operationally to abide by the Convention's core guarantees. Those guarantees were specific. Prisoners were to receive rations comparable in quality and quantity to those of the detaining power's own depot troops. They were to have access to canteens at fair prices, with proceeds managed for prisoner welfare. They were to be housed, clothed, and medically cared for, to standards open to inspection by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Beneath those legal lines sat clear incentives. The Americans knew tens of thousands of their own men were being held in Axis camps. Good treatment at home was leverage for reciprocal treatment abroad, and the Red Cross's inspection regime made that leverage visible. When you normalize the incentives across the system, ice cream and bottled soda sit exactly where you would expect them to, not as luxuries, but as markers that the United States was meeting and often exceeding the comparable rations standard, and that it was doing so in a form that the outside world could understand instantly. By the time a prisoner reached a camp like Hearn in Texas, Algona in Iowa, Papago Park in Arizona, McCoy in Wisconsin, or Clinton in Mississippi, he was entering an apparatus that processed and housed a scale of people almost never seen in American history. Between 1942 and 1946, approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were held across the continental United States, distributed among hundreds of base camps and satellite work detachments. The throughput was industrial. A rail car would arrive. A convoy would transfer men through delousing, medical exams, registration, classification, and a brief orientation to rules that emphasized discipline and the practical benefits of cooperation. Within days, many of those same prisoners would be on work details harvesting sugar beets in Colorado, cutting pulpwood in the upper Midwest, maintaining irrigation ditches in Texas, or moving lumber and cargo near army depots. The camps sat inside the American economy, and that economy ran on reliable calories. The quartermaster corps did not design separate feeding systems for prisoners. It extended the system that fed soldiers with adjustments and oversight. When dairy, flour, or sugar allocations ran through a region, they ran to military installations first. If the baseline U.S. depot troop diet delivered roughly 3,000 calories per day, with protein and fat sufficient for manual labor, the prisoner ration had to land in that neighborhood as a matter of policy and paperwork. When you zoom down to the level of a mess sergeant, the question is not ethical theory, but menu engineering. How do you deliver calories that meet standards, use available stocks, and keep order in the chow line. Ice cream fits because American bases already treated it as a morale food for their own men. The US military had a well-documented taste for it, to the point of commissioning refrigeration units for ships and air bases, and writing about improvised ice cream freezers in field kitchens. By 1945, the Navy even deployed a converted barge in the Pacific to produce and store ice cream for fleet units. An oddity that made perfect sense once you accept ice cream as a cheap morale multiplier. On American soil, where refrigerators, cream separators, and cold storage were far easier to find than on Guadalcanal, a periodic ice cream dessert required no new doctrine. It required milk, sugar, ice, and labor, all of which the quartermaster could source. What looked like indulgence to a prisoner from bomb-scarred Europe was, to the supply officer and the nutrition tables, a convenient way to hit caloric and dairy targets that also calmed tempers after a long, hot day. Place Coca-Cola alongside that logic, and a similar pattern emerges. Coke had been a staple of American consumer life since the interwar years, and had moved into the war economy with unusual privileges. Sugar was rationed nationwide, but the company secured allocations tied to troop morale, and bottling plants near bases treated uniforms as priority customers. At home as overseas, Coke was part beverage, part symbol. A bottle delivered a consistent 6 to 7 ounces of sweet, carbonated calories, and a brand that read, instantly, as American. In US camps, the usual rule was that prisoners could use canteen, scrip or credit from work details, to buy items that soldiers could buy, subject to common-sense restrictions on alcohol and contraband. That meant cigarettes, soap, stationery, and, when stock allowed, a bottle of soda. A German private who had never tasted a carbonated soft drink before could spend his pocket scrip on exactly the same treat that a 19-year-old guard from Kansas would buy after duty. The signal was precise. The rules apply to you because the rules apply to us. For policymakers, the food and drink were instruments that served several strategic ends. First came discipline. A camp with predictable meals, palatable desserts, and canteen items that prisoners valued was easier to run than a camp that treated food as punishment. There is a direct, measurable reduction in friction when men are not hungry, and the difference shows up in guard rosters, disciplinary reports, and medical logs. A scoop of ice cream after a work detail was not a philosophical gift. It was a line item in a budget that reduced fights, theft, and escape attempts. Second came labor. Under the Geneva rules, enlisted POWs could be assigned to non-military labor. In the United States, that labor became vital by 1943 and 1944, as farms and timber outfits lost workers to the draft and to better-paid war industries. Thousands of work detachments left camps every dawn in trucks bound for fields and mills, and they were paid small wages credited to their accounts, often about 80 cents per day for certain categories of work. Well-fed crews worked better and required fewer medical returns. A farmer who received a truckload of prisoners to harvest sugar beets in July needed them to last through the day, not collapse in the rows. That practical calculus created a feedback loop between calories and productivity. Third came intelligence. American interrogators, from formal centers to field teams, repeatedly reported that humane treatment created openings. A prisoner treated decently on arrival, given food that surprised him, and allowed small comforts before questioning was more likely to talk without coercion than a man who believed he had been thrown to enemies. This was not a romantic belief. It was the observed pattern of a military that prized order of battle charts and technical data, and understood that rapport could generate both. Fourth came propaganda and reciprocity. Every Red Cross inspection, every postcard home that mentioned decent meals, every rumor that filtered back through replacement depots in Europe that the Americans were treating prisoners correctly, served the aim of encouraging surrender and undercutting enemy propaganda. On the receiving end, American diplomats and army liaisons could point to the camps when negotiating or protesting. The treatment of American airmen and soldiers in Axis custody. The United States did not treat a bottle of soda as leverage in a formal sense, but the overall pattern of humane treatment formed a reputational bank that officials drew on whenever reports of abuse arrived from Asia or Europe. The sightlines between the mess hall and the world beyond the fence were surprisingly clear. Put the prisoner in the chow line again at Camp Hearn on that July afternoon, and the system reveals itself in ordinary objects. The ice in the milk cans, the heavy cream carried from a local dairy cooperative, the sugar delivered on a rail spur prioritized for military use, the tin spoons stamped with U.S. Army, the bottler's crate reading Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Bryan or Waco, the scrip in the prisoner's pocket that could be exchanged at the canteen window for that cold bottle. Each item came from a supply chain that dwarfed anything the prisoner had seen at home since the war began, and each item did double duty as sustenance and message. Many prisoners only grasped that message when they left the fence on work details. On farms in the Midwest and Texas, German and Italian prisoners performed seasonal labor under Army guard, and met families whose names echoed their own. In Wisconsin and Pennsylvania they heard old dialects, ate foods that mixed German recipes with American abundance, and encountered refrigerators that hummed in kitchens where cream and eggs seemed to exist without ration stamps. On hot days, farmers' wives served ice cream at noon in bowls that overflowed, or sent bottles of soda to the barn after chores. For men who had been taught that America was soft and decadent, the encounter was a cognitive shock. Diaries and letters home, when they survived wartime censorship and the post-war years, returned to the same images: the cold bite of ice cream on the tongue, the fizz of a sweet drink in the throat, and the sense that the country's wealth was not a facade. That shock had immediate effects in camp culture, where Nazi Party discipline tried to maintain ideological cohesion inside the compounds. The daily rhythm of work, food, and small privileges pulled in the other direction. The American system rewarded compliance not with slogans, but with cigarettes and a Sunday movie, with a canteen purchase, with a dessert once a week when the dairy truck arrived. The weight of those small things is easy to underestimate until you place them against the alternatives. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese camps often ignored Geneva standards entirely, and American prisoners faced starvation and disease. In Germany, conditions varied by time and place, with many Western Allied airmen and soldiers receiving treatment within the convention, but others suffering short rations and brutality, especially as the Reich's supply system collapsed in 1944 and 1945. That contrast sharpened the American decision to make camps transparent to inspectors and to maintain standards even when domestic critics asked why. Enemies were eating meat and dairy, while civilians tracked ration points. The War Department's answer was blunt: discipline in our camps, leverage for hours in theirs, and a reflection of what we claim to be. The numbers bear out the scale of the commitment. A base camp feeding several thousand prisoners 3 meals a day would move literal tons of food each week. If a mess officer budgeted a few ounces of ice cream per man once a week during a Texas summer, that meant dozens of large steel containers of frozen dairy rolling into the kitchen, packed in ice and salt. If the canteen imported a few hundred cases of soda per month, that meant negotiating with a bottler for delivery schedules, and storing the crates in a screened room with a padlocked door. Each figure sits within a larger supply chain that routed flour, sugar, and dairy products, past civilian scarcity and into military kitchens. And yet, on the ledger of war, the cost was trivial compared to the outcomes it supported. A calm camp with productive labor detachments freed American soldiers for combat roles and moved crops that fed cities and troops overseas. In practice, this policy generated stories that survived long after the fences came down. A work detail in Iowa walking out of a field in late August and finding a farmer's teenage daughter handing out paper cups of churned ice cream while her mother translated a few words of German learned from her parents. A prisoner in Arizona whose first taste of Coca-Cola came under the shade of a cottonwood at Papago Park, and who would later write that the sound of the cap hissing off the bottle marked his first sense that defeat might not mean ruin. A guard in Mississippi who kept the canteen ledger and learned to count in halting German as he sold soap and soft drinks and posted the monthly balance that, by rule, would be returned to the Prisoner Welfare Fund. Scale these vignettes across hundreds of camps over 3 summers, and you have a social policy as much as a supply plan. it is worth pausing on the moral core beneath the logistics. Americans argued among themselves during the war about the wisdom of what some called coddling. Newspapers ran letters objecting that prisoners seemed to live better than civilians under rationing. The army answered with law and reciprocal logic, but it also answered with a vision of the post-war world. The men behind the fences were not just enemy soldiers. They were potential voices in the reconstruction of Europe. A prisoner who left an American camp with memories of fair treatment and a head full of images of orderly abundance was a subtle asset when his country tried to form a civil society after surrender. No one believed a bottle of soda would convert a man. The belief, rather, was that the total pattern of treatment would leave a residue of credibility. Humane policy also insulated the United States from the corrosive effects that brutality has on the jailer. Guards who worked in a system that treated prisoners according to rules and routines, who handed over bowls of ice cream because the menu said Sunday dessert, were less likely to internalize contempt and more likely to hold their own lines when provoked. That outcome mattered in guard training and in nightly debriefs as much as it mattered to prisoners writing censored postcards home. The legal framework put a floor under treatment. The supply system gave the floor texture and color. Within that floor, ice cream and Coca-Cola did small jobs very well. They acted as reliable signals that the rules were being followed. They softened the edges of captivity just enough to reduce friction. They integrated prisoners into the rhythms of American bases and towns, shaping labor and intelligence outcomes. They served as props in a larger demonstration that democracy could fight and remain itself. And they became, years later, the sensory hooks for memoirs, interviews, and family stories that say more about the United States in wartime than any speech. There were limits and variations. Not every camp had reliable refrigeration. Not every canteen stocked soda in every month. Not every work detail walked into a farmhouse with a churning freezer and a generous host. The American system was vast and imperfect, and records vary across time and place. Yet the aggregate pattern holds. When contemporary accounts are normalized by year and region, the presence of dairy desserts and soft drinks in camp menus and canteens aligns with the broader treatment standards the U.S. Army published and enforced. If you ask why, the simplest operational answer is still the truest. Because the law required comparable rations, because the economy could supply them, because the War Department used food as a tool for order and output, and because every bottle and bowl told a story the United States wanted enemies, allies, and its own citizens to hear. Return one last time to Camp Hearn on that 4th of July. The prisoners sit at long tables. A guard leans bored against the wall near the door, as a radio in the orderly room plays a brass band from somewhere in town. A mess attendant wipes condensation off a metal pan and calls for the next table. In another hour, the canteen will open. The clerk will pop bottle caps against a steel opener, and the hiss will echo in the screened booth. There is no drama in it. The men eat, they talk, they line up for a cold drink, and later many will climb into trucks for a work detail at dawn. Yet in the plainness sits the whole architecture of a wartime policy. The scoop of ice cream and the bottle of Coca-Cola are the smallest visible parts of a deliberate strategy. Keep the camp orderly, keep the labor productive, keep the moral high ground, and keep faith with a set of rules that America wanted to hold up in victory. The Second World War was decided by industrial output, operational decisions, and battlefield courage, not by desserts and soft drinks. Still, if you track the quiet places where values become practices, a summer day in a Texas mess hall has something to say. It shows how a great power used its abundance as an argument, how it turned the comforts of daily life into levers of compliance and symbols of credibility, and how a nation at war chose to say, even to enemies, this is how we treat people under our control. That choice paid dividends in labor, intelligence, and reputation while thousands of Americans sat in enemy camps, hoping that the rules would hold for them too. And in the long after of the war, when some former prisoners returned as immigrants, and others stayed home with a new understanding of the country that defeated them, it left a taste that they could describe decades later with surprising clarity. Cold on the tongue, sweet in the throat, and unmistakably American. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.